Right, exactly.
Jews versus Arabs and whatnot.
I mean, the Jews, like, if you were to ask the Sephardics, whether they're Jewish or Arab, they'd say, wait, it's either one or the other. I thought we were both.
Yeah. But that's just
I also personally don't like that, because if you, in terms of associating Islam with being Arab, like, here's the thing, there are white Muslims that can go through the airport fairly easily, whereas I'm the one who's caught in a random search check, which is kind of bullshit.
Yeah. But the racist aspect is in the text. I should have pressed them on that. No, I didn't. But it's in the book.
Like, I mean, it's in reference to melanin. It's not in reference to something. So it's not in reference to something like nationality. Like, it's in reference to literally the pigmentation of their skin, which is transmitted along genetic lines.
Yeah, but it's seen as a curse. That's the thing. That, like, God caused this to happen to them. I mean, either way, it's biologically and genetically inaccurate. And, I should have brought that to them. But, before they left, I just told them to really think about what they believed and think about why they believe it. And try
Hey, could I ask you a personal question?
Yeah.
If you had to say that there was a particular religious tradition that holds up to scrutiny, or at the very least is the least objectionable, what would you say would be that tradition?
A religious what?
Tradition.
I don't know, because, in terms of evidence,
one thing I actually like about Catholicism is that they actually make claims about the capacity for reason. Like, did you know it's a Catholic doctrine that God's existence has to be proven on the basis of natural reason? Even if he can't, like, there are some things which are a mystery that must be accepted on faith, like the incarnation, the atonement, something like transubstantiation is another one. Whereas the Pope, like, I believe it was, he said that anyone who does not believe that God's existence is provable through the light of pure reason is hereby anathema. Like, it's actually part of the doctrines of the church itself.
What's an anathema? Sorry.
The belief that you can't prove God's existence through pure reason.
Well, see, Calvinists, presuppositionalists would take the opposite view, that you have to presuppose the Bible. Now, I like that position, but, it's just like, to what degree, there always seems to be a cap on the degree to which you can extend that reason. And this is something I see, particularly in the sort of black church that I grew up with, where they stress education. They heavily stress, education for black people to get off the streets and, make something out of their lives, which is a good thing. I support the, I support self-criticism as well. And there's something about it that's not exactly, they recognize racism, but they do it, in a way, they want blacks to improve themselves, and I support that. But they want you to educate yourself, but they don't want you to educate yourself beyond what you've been told that you have to believe. And that's an issue that I have, that they stress education, but only up to a certain point. They don't want you to think too hard about this stuff.
By the way, if you're interested, I actually do have what I'm citing. It's from Pope Pius IX's Vatican First Council. He says, and I quote, If anyone says that the one true God, our Creator and Lord, cannot be known with certainty from things that have been made by the natural light of human reason, let him be anathema.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's right there. What kind of amazes me how a lot of Catholics are going to be like, well, you just have to believe in God because faith. No, it actually says we should be able to prove it. And even if we ourselves couldn't prove it, we'd have to say, well, our authorities who we believe can prove it. Like, you could say, you could give reason on the authority of somebody else, which would also count.
Yeah, I can understand that, but, my church personally doesn't particularly care that much about apologetics. I saw my pastor in January before returning to school, and I told him that I didn't use the word atheist. I told him that I was unsure where I was in terms of belief. Now, this is ridiculous because I was going way too easy on him, so much easier than, much easier than I should have, given certain things. I mean, I could have destroyed him. But that aside, I was very lenient, and I told him I was still questioning, even though I wasn't. But the thing is, where I am now, in terms of why I don't believe, and the reasons behind it, he wouldn't even be able to understand. And it would be a totally useless. It would be just totally pointless. I would explain to him about, did you know that there's no evidence that the Book of Daniel is actually written in 2 languages, and that it gets the order of events regarding the fall of Babylon wrong, or that the Medes were actually conquered much earlier than the Bible. The Medes, the kingdom wasn't divided between the Medes and the Persians, and there's no change in material culture that would be indicative of a large swath of people coming in and overtaking the land of Canaan. And archaeologists have been investigating this for over 100 years, and all this stuff. It would just, laying all that stuff in front of him would just be too much. So, it's not like, anything, there would be much that I could do in terms of trying to assure him of why I don't believe. Because he wouldn't be able to understand my reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And
out of curiosity, have you ever heard of Protestants actually say that the Deuterocanonical text couldn't be part of the Old Testament because they're not in Hebrew? Ever heard of that reason?
They're in Greek, aren't they?
Yeah, many of them are. Some in Aramaic. But I actually give Daniel as an example of why they shouldn't use that, because if they were, they'd actually have to throw Daniel out of the canon too, which many would not be prepared to.
Yeah, because it's not written. It's thought to be probably the last book of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, written, because it's not included in the Septuagint. I don't think, and because of the historical errors I just laid out. But it's written in both Hebrew and Aramaic. I'm talking about people who ascribe the biblical authorship to one, the book of Daniel was written by a guy named Daniel. And in the book of Isaiah was written, even though it spans a few centuries, was written by one person. And the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses, which James White, you know him, believes.
But just to go back to that, in the ancient world, I believe authorship, would have been okay attributed to one person, and others could have contributed to that as long as they held that primary authorship was done by the person in question. So there could have been a Daniel. It could have been written by Daniel, but any addition would have still been considered an authentic addition to the work, so long as it was under his heading or tradition or something along those lines.
Even if it was written in two different languages?
Yeah, because because the person adding to Daniel would have added in the Aramaic. But as long as it's attributed
by one person, attributed.
Oh, right, it's attributed to one person, even though others could add to it, and it would still be considered authentically under his name. Some rabbis actually have used the claim that whenever there's an Aramaic addition to a book, it's usually because the Hebrew was lost and the Aramaic amounts to a rough approximation. Some have actually given that reason.
The Hebrew that we have that is spoken now is not the same as the Hebrew that was spoken then, so that's another thing. It's object.
Actually, it's spoken the same. It might be spoken the same or not, but it's true, and it was very differently written. Mm-hmm. The sort of Hebrew text is completely different than the Hebrew text we find much early on. It has more characters resembling phonetic languages than it does the Hebrew, which came after the exile.
Yeah, and also, if you look at the linguistic structure, it's very similar to the Canaanite languages. In fact, going back far enough, there's no difference. They're the same, which suggests that the Canaanites are just the Israelites are just another type of Canaanite.
I'm actually kind of curious, are Hebrews included as being members of the Canaanite group because they're a minority in population, or are the Canaanites considered, or were their populations pretty even? Like would they have recognized themselves as Canaanites?
No, yeah, they would have. It's a minority, what we call Israel. Israelites don't exist in the way we think they do until some certain time. I forgot what it was. Until you get the Merneptah Shila, that's when Israel is first mentioned in 1296 BCE. But until then, any talk of Israel is kind of irrelevant, sort of.
I would. So it wasn't after. You say it was after the exile, where they recognized the national distinction of identity, or beforehand?
Definitely after. The thing is, we can't talk about beforehand because we don't have a good idea. The picture the Bible presents is not a reliable one on these issues.
Usually, I'll be honest, on the Old Testament and the study of it, my understanding isn't that great. My understanding is much better on the New Testament because that's actually what I have taken a graduate level course on. So you're going to forgive my ignorance a bit on this one. I have a rabbi friend you might be interested in speaking to. He actually knows the Hebrew. And he's actually said he's not fairly convinced with the JDEP thesis, the notion that the 5 books of Moses have 4 authorial traditions. I'm not sure how he makes his case, but if there's anyone to talk to about it, that's just him.
Does he believe that Moses actually existed?
Yes. To be fair, I also do as well, but I actually mostly accept that one on the Testament of Jesus. I'm not sure how much authority or stock you put into that one.
I just go with the archaeological evidence.
So would you say the archaeological evidence suggests Moses didn't exist, or would it say or would say there's no evidence for Moses' existence.
There's no evidence that Moses existed. There's certainly no evidence that the Exodus happened in the Bible as described.
There's actually an agnostic who defends the Exodus account. There's even a documentary that they did about him based on his own work.
Patterns of Evidence?
I'm sorry?
What is it? Is it called Patterns of Evidence?
I think so.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that one.
Also, isn't archaeological evidence on ancient Egypt fairly dynamic, at least currently? I've heard that the list of pharaohs has been changed in order on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah, but I mean, on certain points it can be dynamic. On other points, like with this one, which has been investigated for over 100 years, it's pretty. I mean, this did not happen.
Also, I'm kind of curious about something. What evidence would we suggest finding for a nomadic tribe that would have been preserved in the desert, especially if they were traveling for 40 years? And also, out of curiosity, what are the chances that the Egyptians would have said, this group of Jews escaped on our watch, and they completely thwarted all our powers?
Yeah, that's another thing that people say, that there's no way that the Jews would record any defeats, but I mean, even if you want to leave the Exodus account out of it, I mean, there's no change in material culture that would be indicative of the invasion of Canaan. So on that point, it's not.
History, or archaeological-based history, does seem to be. I wouldn't say completely useless or worthless. I'd say it seems to not produce as much certainty as, let's say, the natural sciences would. I think an objection to the Bible based off of its inability to account that the Earth is spherical, or that doesn't actually stay stagnant while the sun travels around it. I think that's on far better ground as an objection than something based off of anthropology.
Well, I mean, depends on. I would say that it depends on the claim. Although you're partially, I would say you're right on in part, but.
Of course you would. That's why we like each other.
I don't think it. I don't think that the lack of certainty in the archaeological basis gives us any. Some of the people that we have are good record keepers. The Bible is a tome. I mean, they have a way of. So, we have the Nabonidus Chronicle, okay, that recounts the fall of the Babylonian Empire. It's an actual chronicle, and we can date it to the time as contemporaneous to the time in which these events are being recorded. I mean, we actually have the tablet. One of the most important discoveries in all of archaeology ever is the library at Ashurbanipal, an Assyrian king, who left many cuneiform texts that go back up to 4,000 years ago. This is where we get the Enuma Elish. This is where we get the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is where we get the Epic of Atrahasis. This is where we get all of these stories from these ancient manuscripts that go way back. And the Bible, we're talking about the actual sources, or as close to the sources that we can get, and we can translate this. That's not the case with the Bible. We don't even have the originals. We don't have the originals of any book of the Bible. But, these serve as much better sources. And so this is how we know that, the flood legend was borrowed or, redacted in part from things that came before it. And we know that, these ideas this religion didn't begin in a vacuum. This is the whole basis by which we know that Judaism was originally polytheistic.
I believe the term better used to encapsulate Jewish beliefs about God and
henotheism
and other people. No, not henotheism. Actually, I wouldn't say henotheism.
Monolateralism. Monolateralism. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. That's,
see, this is not like talking to you. You are actually quick to remember these sources. Thanks.
But yeah, Yahweh Sabaoth, God of the armies, was chosen as the Jewish God in times of war. But see, the thing is, you don't get that. They're itsy bitsy pieces of the story omitted that make the Bible's reading kind of clunky. So if you read the book of Judges, where the Israelites are constantly going to worship Asherah and Baal, and then God delivers them into the hands of their enemy. I mean, it's absurd. Like, if you don't take this sort of the academic presuppositions and you take the literalist presuppositions of the Bible, if you take the
to let you know, I would neither qualify myself as a literalist nor as someone who purely accepts the academic presuppositions. I don't think I fall on either lines there, but keep going. Sorry.
But if you're a fundamentalist, it must read like the Israelites are crazy, because they keep, how many times has this occurred? They, worship God, and then, and God delivers them out of the hands of the enemy, and then they go back worshiping Baal and Asherah, and then they fall into the hands of the enemy, and then they repent. And then they rebel.
The book of Judges itself says that they were crazy. It literally says near the end of it, although you could probably dismiss it as a later addition. Now, this was that time before the king's rule and everything was chaotic. Something akin to that in the last chapter. Here, I'll find it for you.
It was a critarchy. It was a rule by judges. But if you don't understand the historical context of that, it was because that their gods had functional purposes, and Yahweh was a god of war, and was only functional during times of war, not during times of peace. You see them doing rituals that emulate the polytheists that they despise. So you see Jacob making pillars after he has a dream of the ladder, the dream of Jacob, where he has the dream of the ladder ascending into heaven and angels going around it, essentially adorning it. He makes a pillar, and it's called Matzebo, it's an upright standing stone that polytheists made, and they did this. The Canaanites did this, and they erected these stones in service to their gods. And later in Deuteronomy, God will tell them to destroy these standing stones of the polytheists. And the same Hebrew word, matzebo, that described the erection, what Jacob had erected after his dream, is used. So, this is Jacob participating in a polytheistic practice of the Canaanites that his descendants will later destroy.
Would you mind if I go back to Judges for a bit and speak on that matter?
Yeah.
But I found the verse in question. It's the very last one, which is funny. So that is what the Benjaminites did. While the young women were dancing, each man caught one, carried her off to be his wife. Then they returned to their inheritance and rebuilt their town and settled in them. At this time, the Israelites left the place and went home to their tribes and claimed each of his own inheritance. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. The book of Judges is a very fucked up book. there's one piece where they kidnap a prostitute
and they cut her open, right?
Dismembering her.
Dismembering.
And send her to all
the
the heads of the
tribes
tribes in Israel.
It's really, Judges 19. It's absurd.
Yeah, I mean, but so I think if you look at the genre in question, I think it was written because it was written from the point of view of the king. I think it's a monarchical text, kind of illustrating Israel's history as being anarchic. Everyone's all over the place. And this is why it's good to have a king of Israel. I think it's actually a good juxtaposition to the Book of Kings, wherein Samuel was saying, look, if you have a king, he'll steal your sons, send them to war, marry your daughters. You don't want that. That's more of a Republican book, as it's so called. And there are actually Jews who had a debate whether or not Israel was better off with or without a king because of the tension between the two texts involved in their traditions. Christians, I've actually said as a Christian, I would resolve this by saying this is why human authorities suck in general, because either way you go, you have shortcomings. Kings are unfit because they can not bring the stability that God can, because he's perfect and kings aren't. Whereas judges, while they provide a lot of balance towards one another, they tend to have very divergent rules that divulges into anarchy anyway. God's kingdom is kind of put as the best of all worlds. So, but that's a very Christological view that has no real basis.
I mean, you wouldn't apply it to Judaism. I mean, it would have no say in Judaism, I would imagine, because...
Yeah. I'm actually not sure how my friend Gav would actually tell us about this. He's a rabbi, so he's probably more of an authority on that one. But yeah, from a theological perspective, that's how I would see the king. And just to anyone who's listening to the recording, if I was to actually do biblical scholarship and archaeology, I would probably see these texts just like any others. I wouldn't come to any kind of theological bent about them, and I'd probably agree that it is a source based largely in history, and it's not produced in a vacuum. But because I come at this from a theological position, and I bring my presuppositions into that, I look at the scriptures differently. So I'll be intellectually honest there. You can't really understand the Christian viewpoint of the text without presupposing it. I think we can agree on that much.
Yeah, and going off of what you said about Judges, it says that, I think it's Judges 5:8, where it says that, they chose new gods so there was war in their gates. So that's a sort of, and then also you have, incorporating, the astrological beliefs of the surrounding areas, where it says in Judges 5:20 that the stars fought their way against Sisera. Like, stars can have personalities and things like that. And it's sort of astrology is brought into that mix as well.
Apparently, well, if you understand Hebrew angelology, angels and stars were considered fairly similar beings. In fact, in the book of Revelations, it literally says stars fall from the sky.
Yeah, and in Matthew as well, it says that the stars will fall from the sky. Jesus is prophesying that the stars will fall from the sky. Although, that doesn't make any sense astronomically. Neil deGrasse Tyson has been on this point that, stars are much bigger than the Earth is. And, it's amazing how God creates the stars in one day, but yet the Earth needed 6 days. I mean, these are people who clearly didn't understand the proportionality of objects in space.
I believe the book of Revelations does use stars as an equivocation of angels. I would say it's more metaphor, not necessarily that the stars we see in heaven are angels. I'd say that when the Bible uses stars, it's in reference to angels more often than not.
So when God is telling Abraham to count the stars and those will be like your descendants, is he referring to stars or angels? Especially given that the stars in Judges are the same Hebrew word. They both use the same Hebrew word in Judges as they do in Genesis, referring to the respective verses.
Right. Well, to be fair, even in English, we often use the same word in reference to two different entities, and we tend to differentiate them based on their context.
Yeah.
Right. Even if I was to say that they were both the same term, I could imagine. I could imagine Abraham being in tune with visions of angels. Usually the idea is that the prophets, because they were holy, had vision to greater things than people who weren't. So if you read, for example, Moses going up Mount Sinai, because he was in witness to God, his face was literally glowing. And it's not like everyone else couldn't see God, especially if he was very bright from the top of the mountain. People could even say that they saw him in one specific book. I forget the chapter and verse.
The 70 Elders of Israel?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's Exodus 22.
I believe it would have to do something with the prophet's abilities to be able to see into the spiritual realm or world. Like, this is something that people of today probably wouldn't have. This is actually why in the Orthodox tradition, Moses is literally called the God-seer.
Yeah, because he saw God's backside, didn't
he? Yep. Although it's kind of funny because Martin Luther translates that as butt.
Yeah, I've seen. I know that there are some people who translate that as ass as well.
You want to hear something really funny? If you read the Song of Solomon,
that's a really good book. That's a very. Don't read it to children though.
Oh, I know. There is one awesome verse where the woman compares her husband to the ivory of an elephant. But she's really comparing it to the length of an elephant's ivory. She's saying that her love is really well endowed down there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But if you look at the way that God is envisioned by the early Bible, I mean, it's very obvious to me, and I think you might agree with this, that these two authors are not talking about the same God exactly. I mean, at least in terms of conception, their conceptions are radically different, and their conceptions are changed by their context. Because the God of the Old Testament is basically like a guy walking around who's just getting angry and flares up and is like, "What are you doing?" Like, he comes down and actually talks to people, and he's like, "Hey, you guys need to do this." And then yet the God of Paul is just some more celestial, ethereal being.
Well, I mean, they are coming from a very different place. So if you look at how Paul speaks and talks to people, he's coming from a fairly Greek philosophical tradition.
Yeah.
And his rhetoric shows it fairly well. He is someone who's not only well adept to the Hebrew scriptures, and he is. It's actually incredible how much we miss Paul by not recognizing him as a Jew. But he was also someone who is well known about Greek philosophy as well. I think Paul would have seen God in the same way that the Catholic Church does. They see that there is a God who the Jews see anthropologically, through many of human qualities that we see. And there's also a God of the Greeks who's kind of an unmoved mover of sorts.
Yeah, it's more you have the God placed in the more the context of classical civilization rather than Semitic civilization is sort of different. So the conception is conceived of in the context of classical civilization, Greek and Roman civilization, and then the anthropomorphization is a Semitic byproduct of that.
Mm-hmm. So there's a philosopher of religion I really like, Eleanor Stump. She has this really interesting way of looking at it. It's kind of like how there's an entity in physics that can be seen as either a wave or
a particle.
What's the other one? I'm sorry?
A particle.
A particle or a wave. Just a minute. Yes?
I'm gonna go to the bathroom. Hey, she went to Cornell. Cool. Hey,
Sorry,
I want to go to the bathroom real quick.
Not a problem. I'll be on the line.
You there?
Hey, I'm on the line.
Okay. Yeah. So, we were talking about Eleanor Stump.
Right. She has a very interesting way to see God. For her, God is different in two. There are two kinds of ways you can apply language to God. First, as kind of like light in physics. You can see it as a proton or light, something against that. You're gonna have to forgive me on my lack of knowledge of physics, but likewise, we could say God can be anthropomorphic, fairly human, and we can describe God emotively. But on the other hand, we could also describe them through metaphysics found by theologians and ancient philosophers, and both ways are legitimate.
Well,
This is
yeah. They're legitimate, but then there are and this has been Dan Barker really hits at this point when going at the coherence of God, and I like his approach because he uses the Bible and says that, okay, so you have a God that does this in the Bible. How does that make sense given these properties? So, a God who knows everything, why is he calling out to Adam, where are you, in the Garden of Eden? Why is he walking around like a guy who's just, trying to find something? Like he walks around in the garden, and it says that he sniffed the slaughter, the sacrifice of the altar. Does God have a nose when he's sniffing? Like, does he have olfactory?
okay. So in terms of that, the whole point of anthropomorphizing God is to better understand him, especially if you're an ancient people. So there are two kinds of qualities you touched on. Ones are qualities which pertain to God himself, and ones that pertain to properties of how we see and understand God. So the walking would be of the former sort. Whereas other things like God smelling or knowing through smell and then doing something else is more him being anthropomorphically understood. So God doesn't need to smell in order to know. God also doesn't need to see, nor does he need any other senses. But the whole point of it is so that the Hebrews themselves can better understand and better communicate to their followers and descendants. Whereas if you understand God, walking around, talking to people, those are God that's God revealing himself in a mode wherein Jews or human beings can understand and visualize him in. So in the first sense, in one sense, God is, this is It's how the Jews are perceiving him. In another sense, that's how Jews are thinking about him. These aren't properties of God in his existence or essence. Rather, these are properties of God in the human sense. Or
in the conception? In the conception?
Yeah. In the conception.
So, but is it a conception when, in Ezekiel 4, God tells an unknown, presumably Ezekiel, to take a block of clay and put it in front of him and draw the city of Jerusalem on it, and then, lie on your left side for 390 days and eat bread cooked over a steaming pile of human shit? It's just the pedantic nature of that.
No, if you lived in the desert area and you needed fuel fast, shit is usually your primary source. It wasn't uncommon. So that has to be taken into account. Plus anything that has fire burning over it kind of kills the diseases of unsanitariness. So in order for, what you had to make sort of at those days, it wasn't uncommon. In terms of, Ezekiel going through all that, God usually asks people to go through fasts, diets, even movements, as forms of religious experiences. Think of the Buddha meditating under the Bodhi tree for 40 days without any kind of food or sustenance. Like, these are God's prophets were not of the intellectual sort. They were mystics. And this isn't even uncommon in the West. I mean, think of Socrates, who's like the father of Greek intellectualism. He himself had mystical visions. He usually went on the road. So it's not uncommon in mystical traditions to understand God through anthropomorphic symbols, conceptions, and even undertaking odd religious practices.
Reading from Ezekiel 4:10, it says, weigh out 20...
yeah, that's how I would understand Ezekiel.
Yeah, it says, weigh out 20 shekels of food to each eat each day, and eat it at set times. Also measure out 1/6 of an hin of water, and drink it at set times. An hin is 2/3 of a quart, and drink it at set times. Eat the food as you would a loaf of barley bread. Bake it in the sight of the people, using human dung for fuel. The Lord said, in this way the people of Israel will eat defiled food among the nations where I will drive them. Then I said, Ezekiel, not so, sovereign Lord. I have never defiled myself. From my youth until now I have never eaten anything found dead or torn apart by wild beasts. No impure meat has ever entered my mouth. Then God says, very well, I will let you bake your bread over cow dung instead of human dung. It's just, and then he has to lay on his right side.
Okay, but cow dung, come on.
Yeah, and then he has to lay on his right side for 40 days. It's just, it's, but also, the Ezekiel...
Religious, mystical practices. I can't make sense. Like, you're not alone. I also can't make... Yeah, you're not alone here. I also... But...
Yeah?
Oh, I was going to say, I'm kind of like you. I'm not sure what each and every specific point of the practice God is asking Ezekiel to do has any significance. I'm not, I can't read the mind of a mystic, nor do I read the needs of a mystic, especially any particular one. Why does Buddha need to meditate for 40 days? Why couldn't he find enlightenment in 35? Like mysticism is, by its very nature, a hard practice to understand, especially if it's to understand something of a transcendent reality. I think there are some modern attempts to understand it. I believe Sam Harris has even tried to put a scientific slant on spirituality recently.
Yeah, I really like that.
In the ancient world, it was pretty tough to figure out. like especially what it really could have signified to anyone other than the person going through the experience or the persons.
Well, yeah, that's another thing. I mean, Daniel Dennett talks about how, in folk religion, they have no concept of faith. So like Joseph Smith, for example, was raised in like a folk form of Christianity. They don't have a concept of faith. It's just what everybody knows. And that was sort of the same thing with the early Hebrews, which is that it was just more of a cultural, tribal thing. But the problem is when you extend that into the 21st century, where your belief in God is interrupted by so many other contributions to society, you need something that you lose that sort of direct connection. And when you're trying to extrapolate these experiences, it can seem very hard to do so because you're grasping on something that is removed from its context. And that's why I think you get a lot I think that's what you see with the rise of Pentecostalism in part.
Well, I mean, the notion of faith wasn't really fleshed out until, theologians got to it from the medieval age onward. Like, if you read Augustine, who bases his whole worldview on knowledge on God, he says that there's two ways of really knowing things, and he divulges knowing and wisdom. Wisdom is dedicated to the transcendent world, whereas knowledge is more of lowly bodies and physical manifestations. For him, we even have knowledge through wisdom, because all wisdom starts by accepting the authority of God. Now he's just limited to Christianity. He thinks that there are a lot of traditions that rightfully come from the authority of the transcendent world. This is why he really likes Platonism, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But looking onto there, he thinks that faith is the proper authority, and by seeking understanding from that faith, that's how we come to know things. And this is kind of where faith talk develops, because if you look at Paul, like his basic thing is, when we look at faith, what we have to do is, it's all about trusting God. Like, faith in Greek literally just means trustworthiness or a commitment to an authority. And Augustine actually gets his whole philosophy from the book of Isaiah, where it says, unless you have believed, you shall have not understand. So before you can accept any kind of truth, you have to first kind of assent to its authority. Like, he even said this about Aristotelians and Platonists. The Platonist is just ascending to the truth of the forms and the one, whereas the Aristotelian is ascending to the authority of man's rational soul. Like, you have to say that these things are capable as entities of telling you right from wrong. And it's really in that tradition where it develops. The source in Isaiah is actually a translation from the Septuagint, and I heard a mistranslation of that. It's actually kind of interesting where it comes from originally.
Okay. I have to go soon. I think we can go for like 3 more minutes. Wow, I can't believe we started on Islam and then Mormonism and then this. But I think if you ask most scholars, they'll say that the way they understood it is inevitably the product of, I mean, you can never get back to the way they understood it. Especially with something so far removed. And, even the most doctrinaire Christian will tell you that the Bible is the product of multiple authors, attributed to 40, but, the evidence doesn't bear that out. But yet, they came from different places and were of different backgrounds and had different views on a lot of things. Political views and whatnot. I mean, these are people from a long. So when they're trying to, and this is what my Old Testament, my Hebrew Bible teacher told me, is that when people are trying to use the Bible to justify certain things, I mean, they're assuming that, a unanimous author, not unanimous, just one sole author for the Bible, when that's not what the Bible said. That's what Job said, or that's what the author of Job, or the author of Habakkuk or Nahum. Right?
Well, I mean, this is actually kind of interesting because it's a fairly Islamic take on the Bible, which the Muslims will say that the Quran is written by God and He's their one author, whereas even I can't speak to Christians, but if you look at what the Vatican says about the Bible, and Vatican II specifically, it says that the Bible is the true word of God, authored by man. Like they'll say, yeah, there's the truth of God that's in there, but there's also man's authorship, which undergirds it. So you can't really understand the divine part without first understanding, the human part. And by the way, I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm glad to have you as a speaking partner.
Oh yeah, you're welcome. Just to some degree, it might be to your advantage, at least to the advantage of Christians, that they have that contradiction is more apparent within their books than within the Quran, because I think mathematically speaking, it is easier to find authorial intent in the Quran than there is in the Bible. So it's harder, you have less wiggle room. And many Muslims and even some Christians, or many Muslims pride themselves in that you have less wiggle room within Islam to just, sort of half-ass it, and because there's so much, and there's so much, the Hadith itself is longer than the entire Bible combined.
Well, to be fair, one thing I like as a Catholic is that there are doctrines which the Vatican will say, if you believe X, you are anathema. Like, it's not hard to hold my feet to the fire on certain things. Like,
I can understand.
Which I kind of enjoy. I can't believe all of a sudden that the Trinity doesn't exist. Like, that's something I'm committed to as a Catholic. Like, if I was a Protestant, I could at least say, well, the majority of Christian tradition, except me for some reason, came up with the truth, and there is no Trinity. That's also a very untenable position, but some people actually even go that far.
Yeah. But I like that, in that regard, at least you're more intellectually honest with your tradition, I guess. I'm not a believer. You're more intellectually honest with your tradition through the good parts and, I guess, the bad parts. At least, that's what's been indicated to me.
Thank you. I appreciate the compliment.
The more, even I've talked to Jews about Israel, and their things, and they're more honest with that in that aspect as well. Even if we do inevitably disagree, they're less butthurt. Really, Muslims are. I guess for understandable reasons, because there's real bigotry, but
it's kind of. Hopefully, maybe Muslims will adopt some Christian perspectives and maybe change their mind on it, or at least completely co-opt it. Like, I wouldn't, even if it's inauthentic, I'd rather somebody be inauthentic than deadly. I've never gotten that. I never got the preference some atheists have for fundamentalists. Well, at least they're consistent, yes, but they're also more harmfully detrimental. I'd much prefer them to be inconsistent and irrational as opposed to irrational and dangerous.
Well, you can, but at least making the connection, that's part of the thing, instead of being an obscurantist. I think it's just the atheists don't like the obscurantism when it about it and about the problems of certain things. But they should really, I guess, read more. Muslims speaking should, not to say that they don't read more, but not denying, the connection that, at this point, I don't even know how you could say that there's just no, as if I was reading this article
attacking this position. I'm going to send it to you on Big Think. And it's like the idea that ISIS is basically just a bunch of mean people with guns.
Like someone is defending that position with a straight face.
Well, it was some postmodernist, but I mean, this article attacks that. Graham Wood's article is much more thorough. That it's not like saying this is Islam, like inevitably, but the idea that this is just a bunch of mean people, like they're throwing gay people off of buildings just to be mean to them. It's just ridiculous. Like there's no.
Yeah, I mean, have you ever met granted, I think gay sex is icky, but it's never been icky to me in such a way that I want to throw off the cliff anyone who's had it. Like, even people who, I'm not even that mean to people who've committed incest or bestiality. I don't think I'd be as mean. Mean enough to throw them off the building. I might be severely disgusted, but that's about it.
Well, I mean, maybe they are disgusted, but I mean, it's in their book. It's just an issue of how do they react to that, and do they legitimize that? And the claim that this has nothing to do with a religion is just really the main obstacle to confronting the issue for what it is. Anyway.
All right. Well, see you, man. Great talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. Nice 2 hours.
Have a good. Okay, have a good one.
Yeah, you too.